Over the past week, US President Donald Trump's overtures towards Greenland have caused serious alarm in Europe. Trump's latest threat to impose an additional 10% tariff on 8 European countries from February 1st, unless they agree to let the US acquire the territory, has prompted European leaders to consider using the EU's anti-coercion instrument, otherwise known as its trade bazooka, against the US, with some political columnists suggesting that Europe is now in an accelerated process of de-risking from America. This has all led to some suggestion that it might be a good idea for the EU to start getting closer with China, as a sort of hedge against the apparent imminent collapse in EU-US relations. So in this video, we'll take a look at how Trump is pushing Europe towards China, and the limits of any EU-China rapprochement. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's start with a bit of context about how EU-China relations have developed over recent decades. Since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, EU-China trade has surged, with China rapidly becoming a major destination for European exports and a major supplier of imports for the EU. However, over time, China's trade surplus with the EU has grown. In other words, China has increasingly exported more to the EU than the EU has exported to China, and European firms have struggled to compete with Chinese companies in both the Chinese and EU markets. European policymakers see these trade imbalances as a symptom of China's unfair trading practices, citing things like China's generous state subsidies, which artificially lower the prices of Chinese goods, barriers to access in the Chinese market for EU companies, and concerns about human rights in the Chinese supply chain, all of which have strained EU-China trade relations. To address these, the EU has introduced a number of essentially protectionist measures, including tariffs and industrial subsidies, which aim to help European companies compete on a level playing field with their Chinese counterparts. European policymakers have also become increasingly anxious about the dependence on certain Chinese imports, and Beijing's willingness to weaponize these dependencies, especially when it comes to rare earths. To address this, since 2023, the EU has pursued a policy of de-risking from China, in an effort to reduce its dependence on China in critical sectors like energy, tech, and digital infrastructure. As such, the EU has expanded its network of trade agreements and taken steps to phase out certain Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE from all critical infrastructure due to national security concerns. Now, during the Biden administration, this policy was essentially pursued in tandem with the US. Europe and America used identical rhetoric about de-risking from China, imposed similar tariffs against Chinese imports, and explicitly coordinated on sanctions, with European firms like ASML helping the US enforce tech sanctions on Beijing. There were some moments of tension. European leaders were furious when Biden revealed his Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, because they thought that it would encourage European companies to shift their business to the US. But for the most part, the EU and US were pretty aligned. Obviously, this has all changed with Trump. For starters, the Trump administration has been actively unhelpful in coordinating sanctions. A couple of months ago, for instance, the US put pressure on the Netherlands to take control of Nexperia, a tech company based in the Netherlands but controlled by a Chinese company called WingTech. The Netherlands duly obliged, sparking outrage in Beijing, before the US flip-flopped only a couple of weeks later, embarrassing the Dutch government. More generally, Trump seems to have spent more time complaining about Europe's trading practices than he has about China's, saying on multiple occasions that the EU is somehow worse than China, apparently because the EU runs trade surpluses with the US, despite the fact that when you include not just goods but also services, trade is pretty much balanced. In fact, Trump has arguably launched not one but 2 trade wars against EU countries. The first on so-called Liberation Day last April, when Trump imposed 20% tariffs on EU imports to the US, which was then reduced to 15% by July with the signing of the now suspended EU-US trade deal. And the second, which is playing out now, by proposing an additional 10% tariff on 8 European countries, France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, from February 1st, to pressure them into giving up Greenland. This is a step too far for Europe, which has responded by suspending the EU-US trade deal, dusting off some retaliatory tariffs it prepared during last year's trade negotiations, and even setting the stage to use its so-called trade bazooka. This prospective severing of EU-US economic relations has made it look like the EU is now de-risking not from China, but from America. This has subsequently led to some suggestion that the EU should consider moving closer to China in the hopes that a better EU-China relationship would act as a sort of hedge against any collapse in transatlantic relationships. And there are two senses in which this might work. The first is economic. In other words, a deeper economic relationship with China might offset some of the economic pain involved in de-risking from the US. China has a growing consumer class who might be able to provide a new source of demand for European exports if European businesses are cut off from the US, which has long been their largest export market. And conversely, China might be able to replace the US when it comes to imports that previously came from America, if they're cut off in any trade war. Now, for this to work, China will presumably have to address some of Europe's long-standing concerns about its trade practices, including, most importantly, increasing Chinese imports of European goods, which has long been a bugbear in the EU-China relationship. But Chinese leaders have recently signalled an openness to this. At Davos on Tuesday, for instance, Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng claimed that, quote, "We never seek a trade surplus. On top of being the world's factory, we hope to be the world's market too." The second sense in which China and the EU might be able to get closer is their mutual commitment to the basic principles of international law. Neither China nor Europe has an unblemished record here, but it's hard to deny that they're more committed to the basic principles of international law at the moment than the Trump administration is, which is currently threatening to use military force against European allies in Greenland, withdrawing from basically any multilateral institution it can see, and even trying to create a sort of alternative to the UN in Trump's so-called Board of Peace. At least judging by their public rhetoric, both China and Europe do seem to believe that it's still important to protect the basic principles of international law, even if they're not quite working as advertised. And Trump's escalating assault could foster cooperation between China and the EU on this front. Now, you're probably looking to follow this story as it develops, but how are you supposed to keep track of which outlets online are actually trustworthy, and which are just fabricating a false narrative for you to follow? Well, that's where our sponsor this week, Ground News, comes in. That's because Ground News is a website and app that helps you to make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. Now, things can get increasingly overwhelming, with thousands of articles being thrown at us every day, but Ground News puts all those articles into one place, helping you to fully understand the story from start to finish. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each source. For instance, if we take this story on Trump using his Nobel Peace Prize snub as justification for demanding Greenland, we see that there are 256 sources reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the left. We can even dive deeper into how each side is reporting by using their bias comparison feature, which tells us that the left is framing Trump's actions as ominous and unhinged, while the right is praising his unprecedented accomplishments. Our absolute favourite feature, though, is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all of the stories that you might not have seen on your feed. So even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's still good to know what's being left out of your bubble. Now, you're probably used to being fed the news that your algorithm has decided is best for you, and breaking out of that spiral is harder than ever. Ground News will do that work for you though, freeing you from the algorithmic restraints and letting you think freely again. So if you want to start questioning the narrative, instead of just consuming it, you can join Ground News today. And using our link, you'll get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe using the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the code on screen. And you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.